that we should sort of talk about what has happened and is still happening at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. How many of you are familiar with, or have at least heard what's going on there? Right, so that's why I'm going to do away with a lot of the details. So just to give you a brief summary of what happened, so this is a few weeks ago, so February 9th, student members of the Democratic Students Union, a pretty ultra-leftist student group on the JNU campus, they called for a meeting to protest what they termed the judicial killing of Afzal Guru, who is a convicted Kashmir separatist and a convicted terrorist who was hanged in 2013. He was convicted for his involvement in the 2001 Indian Parliament attacks. As this meeting was publicized throughout the university campus, and sort of leading up to the event itself, student members of the right-wing All India Student Organization, the ABVP, or the Akhil Bharatiya Janata Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, they reached out to the university administration to ban this event on the grounds that such a talk or discussion would be harmful for the university atmosphere, right? And fearing violent clashes, the university administration pretty much cowered to this demand of the ABVP group and made it pretty much impossible for the student organization to hold this meeting. So the DSU leaders enlisted the help of several other student organizations on campus. Most of them are pretty left-leaning and student-led sort of activist organizations, and they had this meeting anyway. What followed was the ABVP leaders showed up at this meeting and threatened the students and engaged in their own sort of sloganeering, and almost it did end up in a lot of like sort of physical altercations between the two student groups. And it's of particular importance that some of the things that were said at this meeting turned out to be really important for what was following, what was to come up later. There were several Kashmiri students who had shown up to this meeting, and particular sort of threatening messages were also hurled against these Kashmiri students, because the central issue that this meeting was about what's happening in Kashmir, sort of the army's atrocities in Kashmir presently, and sort of there are several sort of Kashmiri separatist groups who believe that Kashmir should have its own right to self-determination and separation from the Indian nation state. February 12th, Kanhaiya Kumar, who has become the sort of the hero, the face of this movement, him and several other students and a professor were arrested on charges of sedition, specifically for raising anti-national slogans, slandering the Indian armed forces and the Indian judicial system, inciting violence, and more sort of crazy charges, right? And we had terms like anti-national and sedition, dividing the national discourse along really ugly lines of nationalism, Hindutva politics, political maneuvering, and misrepresentation of facts, right? So, and what followed was sort of, a clash of slogans, and that were going to be like twisted and conflated beyond recognition and out of context by the media, the ABVP and the larger BJP government. So Kanhaiya Kumar was recently released on March 2nd on a provisional bail due to the sheer lack of evidence against him and the great miscarriage of police procedure. But it was revealed in the weeks following the highly publicized event that not only had Kumar's himself not participated in the sloganeering, there was a lot of false video footage, like doctored footage, that was distributed by the news media, and there was no real evidence against him. Some of his friends are still in jail, and there are protests and marches that are currently being organized as we speak to get them released. And what has happened is we're now in the midst of discussions about what happened, and we're sort of wrestling with the ideas of anti-nationalism. What does it mean to be anti-national in India? What they did, was it simply a matter of bringing out anti-national slogans, or were they really breaking the law or not? So I think a central issue that we could definitely talk about was, and one that I think alarmed me more than anything else, not only with the JNU issue, but also the other two topics that we're going to talk about today, the Trump protest here as well as in South Africa, is sort of this misunderstanding of constitutional rights, especially when it comes to like the rights of freedom of speech and expression. Because as far as the JNU protests are considered, whatever slogans they brought out, it was absolutely covered by the constitutional right to freedom of expression and speech, and the right to peacefully gather and demonstrate in a public place. But the more and more, like the conversations I've had with my friends, my family, it seems like there is a misunderstanding of what that right even means. So that really troubled me and made me think that, maybe this is worth talking about, like, why are there such different definitions of, or understandings of what these rights are, right? And also, at the center of this sort of whole fiasco is the sedition law. And there have been several discussions about whether this sort of really antiquated vestige of our colonial past, this sedition, should it even be part of a democratic society, or should it be used in the way that it was used? Even in the antiquated law that we do have, it is clearly mentioned that unless there is incitement to violence or tangible events that would occur in the immediate future, that law cannot be invoked. But that's not what happened. They were still put in jail. So I think, at least the way that I read this entire issue, it is safe to say that what they were put in jail for is not really what they were put in jail for. And that, I feel like, that's what made me think that there are deeper issues that, going on here that nobody wants to really talk about. So maybe that could be.
Yeah, let's, do you guys want to just bring up your topics as well, and then?
Sure, we can do that, yeah. So I really wanted to talk about the university protest in South Africa, which started with the Rhodes Must Fall movement about almost exactly a year ago. Because I think, there's a lot of, even though there's a lot of differences, there's also a lot of similarities. There's a university setting, there's the issue of freedom of expression, but in the South African case, we have a little bit of distance from it because it's been a year now. B, it's an example where this sort of notion of freedom of expression in the university setting was sort of pushed to the extreme. That since the movement started in 2015, there's been, and I won't, unless you want me to get into the details of that, I won't get into the details of it. Is everybody familiar with what happened? No? Okay. So the movement started on 9th March 2015, and it was directed against a statue at the University of Cape Town that commemorated Cecil Rhodes.
February 9th.
March.
Oh, okay.
March 9th, oh sorry, February 9th?
I'm getting it.
Yeah, anyway, March or February, about a year ago. And Rhodes is, like everybody knows Rhodes from the Rhodes Scholarship. There was a statue of Rhodes at the university campus.
And he's an arch-colonialist too,
Yeah.
who's responsible for the annexation of much of the southern part of the continent.
Of the continent, and if I remember correctly, he was the man behind the diamond trade at the time. That's where his wealth comes from.
De Beers.
Yeah.
De Beers.
De Beers is this?
Yes. And that's sort of where the funding for the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford comes from even today. And so these students protested that, this statue must be removed. This is University of Cape Town. We're aware of a violent past. Why is the statue still here? And the university said, well, yes, we condemn it, but they refused to take action. And so on March 9th, I believe, one of the protesters flung human poop onto the statue. And it was, so at the time he portrayed it as being an act of political art, right? And so he flung the poop on, he had a drum, so he was beating the drum, he had a whistle in his mouth, and it turned into like a performance of sorts. And students gathered, the university officials came and they're like, what the hell is going on? And he's like, this is performance art, I'm doing it for one of my classes or something like that. And then the media showed up, and so even though he hadn't anticipated that this would turn into this big movement, that's how it started. And then once it did turn into a movement, a board of sorts started taking this up more formally. And so this is a quote from their website, which I found. It said that the University of Cape Town students, workers, academics, and interested staff members refuse to be alienated in their own university. If the institution will not bring true transformation to us, we will bring it to them. And so once after that, these movements spread all over the country, including the Stellenbosch University, Rhodes University, University of Pretoria, University of Free State, and even the Oxford University. And even though it just started with like people flinging poop onto the Rhodes statue, it more recently it resulted in people sort of storming into university campuses, burning down paintings, predominantly portraits of white people collected from university buildings. They torched vehicles, transport bus, petrol bombed the office of the university's vice chancellor. So this is sort of, and even though the reasons for protest are justified and valid, somehow once it started, it took a life of its own and turned into something that people had little control over. And a number of protesters were, of course, jailed. They're still in jails. And so I think because this happened about a year ago, and it's still happening in Africa, in South Africa, and what's happening in JNU happened fairly recently. So I wanted to use this as an example to sort of see, well, it started here now and it started peacefully, as it had in South Africa, but it took a life of its own and turned into something completely different. So maybe, through this comparison, we can try and understand how these things do have the ability to take a life of their own, and whether that's important when you consider the university setting as a site of protest and resistance.
And also, I think another interesting parallel was that in both these cases, it seems like in this particular instance, I think the UIC event is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't start out as these big movements. Like this JNU event, it was just a very intimate, much like our own meeting to protest some of these issues that these students thought needed to be protested. It became bigger in this case when it turned, like violent and media coverage. And in this case, because there was so much media coverage on this wrongful arrest of these students. So they didn't start out as organized protests and big events, but they became like that. With the UIC case, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I think, Tanya, you want to speak about that?
Can we keep it brief since we all...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll also take this somewhere else because I also found a connection there. But I think, there's this issue that we're talking about free speech and the role of the university and free speech and sort of Trump coming, but then saying, this whole idea of saying no to Trump and how that sort of is against the First Amendment, right, of allowing him to speak, especially since we're a public institution and the pavilion is a public place that says if you sort of not allow him to sort of express his political beliefs, that infringes on his rights for free speech. But then you have the role of the protest, which is also an example of free speech itself. But I think the discourse circulating the entire event has been one of security, which seems... I think it can be argued to a degree somewhat infantilizing to a degree if you're constantly sort of
What?
infantilizing
Mhm.
to a degree if you're only mobilizing sort of this issue of security and the safety of students and this and that. Because I think that sort of, I think it depends on who is sort of expressing these issues of safety, and I know professors as well as students have expressed a concern for safety, but is that sort of a way, do you bring up safety when you can't bring up free speech?
Yeah. Molly Duane had a post up on Facebook, I think right after the UIC protest saying, I was there, I stand with the student, but it was for the security. It was about if they're going to take down my students and they'll take me down first or something like that. I do feel like it's because you can't really talk about free speech without, getting people contesting the veracity of the event itself, the protest itself. So I think, as you said, the security thing is being used as a way to talk about that protest and bring legitimacy to the protest without touching upon the issue of free speech.
Yeah. Also, I think something I noticed with yours that I think in general with politics and protests is like sort of the role of anger or like outrage and sort of also like the defilement of the protest and how we can think of sort of the more affective qualities that these protests take on when thinking of when does it become sort of, as like the media says, like an angry mob versus an organized political movement, and sort of where free speech lies and expression.
But see, in the case of the UIC protests, though, immediately in the aftermath, the first statement that Trump released was that they prevented us from speaking at Chicago and our First Amendment rights were infringed. But the truth is it wasn't. There was nothing stopping him from coming to that rally, and forget the fact that, Trump, facts have never deterred Trump from saying what he wants to say, right? But
He also claimed that the police had advised him.
which is which
apparently false.
police departments seldom do this, but they have issued statements after counter statements that no, we didn't. We absolutely did not discourage him from coming here. And look, I mean, we absolutely expected that he would be there, and the whole sort of point of the protest when we couldn't, cancel this event was that inevitably there were going to be protesters inside, as have been at every one of his rallies recently. They would be kicked out. There would be violence and aggression against those protesters, and that we would just be there when that happened, so that we would just at least outnumber the supporters who were there. But we never thought that he would not show up at all, right? So I don't know how I feel about sort of twisting the First Amendment into something that
I want to also point out something that when you were speaking earlier about JNU, and we spoke about how Kanaya's constitutional rights to free speech was being taken away by this mob of protesting ABVP people. But on the other hand, and we don't support that, right? As a group, I think we don't support that. But in the case of Trump, we're on the other end.
no, but
We're on the other side. Yes, I'm not saying his free speech was taken away. No, I'm not saying that. But for the media, it's almost as if we who support Kanaya Kumar and his right to free speech are almost on the other. So the question I was raising is the fact that we are all fairly left-leaning, right? Does that have something to do with
sounds like so
free speech? Fairly.
I skew fashion.
Can I
I'm coming on the backside.
I have to say something there. There's a fundamental difference between the two things, right? The problem is in India is not that their free speech there's no doubt that it was infringed upon because they were put in jail for exercising that free speech. That is not what happened here. They're not, this is the same right we're talking about, right? But in one case, this was absolutely infringed because they were put in jail because of what they said. right? Whereas in this case, he chose not to exercise it. Does that everybody see the difference? That the whole point of free speech is that you cannot be arrested for utilizing this freedom.
But isn't that like maybe like the question, because if we attempt to compare them on the idea of free speech, it becomes a little confusing. But I think one thing we can do is ask the question if what Trump says, is that free speech or is that hate speech? Right? We have to qualify what is the message that Trump is talking about. And if part of the message is hate speech is regulated, right? We know that free speech is not.
Isn't hate speech allowed in the American Constitution?
Yeah,
it's not allowed in Britain, but it is here.
It is allowed.
And that's why you and I can burn flags and.
Yeah.
You can't do hate crime.
It's not
right, that's the crucial distinction. You can say whatever you want, but don't try doing it.
Well, I think that's precisely the problematic should lie, right? Because hate speech, I think, should be regulated, should be suppressed, right? Because I think to suppress hate speech is not to be intolerant.
But
see, hate speech is what, in the case of Indian sedition laws, can get you thrown into prison.
Exactly. So see, I would not agree with that personally, because that's a very slippery slope, and it is so open-ended that anything can be considered hate speech.
I don't know, because I think the speech that undervalues diversity, I think his speech really like challenges diversity.
So
by calling like
so
some
that is
people
like hate speech against minorities.
And diversity isn't written into the Constitution
Right.
either. I mean,
It's a very slippery slope, I think. And I personally wasn't there at the protest to stop him from speaking. I was just there such that, right, if he speaks, so do we. That was the sort of balance we were trying to. I would never try to definitely stop someone from saying whatever distasteful thing they want to say. It's just that if you do that, I will do it too. That's where I come from.
Wasn't the joy when we found out about the cancellation?
Yeah.
The part that, in fact, his speech had been violently stopped, right? I mean, with all of the potential of violence, which is to say, the kind of that in some sense it was, you can fight white supremacy with violence, right? That seemed to be at least a thread of the satisfaction that at least I definitely got when I got the notification on my phone right after when I got the protest. Like, oh, he canceled, right? So even if he had arrived and people had violently ended the rally, that would, to me, would still seem like there's a legitimacy to that. But the point at which it seems to not become legitimate is when constitutional law comes into the picture, which is to say a kind of access to the universal or the state. Because, I mean, I don't know, that's small room.
We are being videotaped. We are being videotaped.
But I mean, am I crazy here? Am I the only one who
No,
is saying
no.
No, but that
his silencing was part of the joy.
Right, definitely.
Yeah.
But that makes me think about something else. So if violence gives us a certain form of satisfaction, does it, I mean, yes, you're satisfied, but does it really change anything at the end of the day? Violence is not the solution. Yes, in terms of, then the question is, and if, we as protesters, what can we do that will actually stop Trump, right? Or try to ameliorate the situation.
That was also at the center of my problem with the media coverage itself. Have any of you even looked at the statistics of whether, I got so mad Saturday morning when every single news outlet was, the headline was violent clashes. When there are 10,000 people protesting and there are 3 injuries and 5 arrests, can you really term that as a violent protest?
And 2 of those injuries were cops, so they
Were cops. And one of those arrests were mistaken. It was a CBS informer, Shubham Dev, who was wrongfully.
I wonder if it was because he was brown.
It's so
possible.
So can you really? That is statistically insignificant in terms of violence. If you really, because even the police chief released a statement saying this was an overall majorly peaceful protest. So I was really upset that every headline said violent clashes.
But I think it was necessary for both media and Trump for those clashes to be categorized as violent.
It's going to be misrepresented down the line.
Yeah.
Whether it's like indiemedia.org or whether it's foxnews.com. Like that's, I don't think that it's like a,
Yeah.
you're gonna get it right in any context. I mean, this like, I don't know, whenever I go to like WTO protests, it would be like, oh, the news only said there were like 5,000 people there, when in fact there were 20,000. This is routine. So I feel like the question of representation is not a whole lot of payoff because there's going to be misrepresentation.
It's going to be there, yeah, it's a given.
I was wondering, would there be any difference if the protesters had remained entirely outside the building, you know, thousands chanting, and the Trump supporters had been inside the building and allowed to go on?
I don't think you would have canceled the rally then.
But
Would that have been a
half the stadium
better
was
way
empty.
of exercising resistance and expressing discontent?
Well, does this
And you
become
just
a
wait
question
for-
of dialogue then, possibly? Like sort of like a democratic dialogue that happens, because you know, we're talking about hate speech or about sort of the ability for two voices to speak at the same time, but then, you know, you sort of brought up the idea of it's hate speech against minorities, so that brings up that notion of there already is like an implicit voiceless individual. So it seems, I wonder if the question then is about dialogue or about having sort of an actual conversation, but is it possible?
But in this particular case, responding to your comment, Professor Leakey, like, I think the infiltration was a major part of the resistance, because if you look back, his rallies have been these sort of controlled environments, right? Where every single dissenting voice has been
They have
categorically thrown out. And they,
Action.
so the fact that that controlled environment was compromised was essential to the cancellation, right? That he wouldn't have that sort of yaying crowd that just nods with everything he says. He wouldn't have that. There would be, the dissenting voices would outnumber.
But if the dissenting voices outnumber, have we violated his free speech rights?
That's a good question.
That's what I'm saying. And
But
if
it was not-
the dissenting voices had been outside in mass numbers,
But it was not an intentional. It was not intentional. Like each individual who went there did not intend or wouldn't have any way of knowing how successful his protest would have been, right? So how can that be violating his Trump's free speech? Because this was a person coming and saying, "I will do my bit,"
Right.
but only if others showed up. So then.
And I think they showed up with the expectation that nobody would show
Yes.
up.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
even we thought there were like 100 people inside. We were shocked when thousands came pouring out. So, and that was again like the way he turned it later, that this was a planned thing. Yeah, we publicized it, but it happened so that because entry to these events are publicly advertised, and he gives out tickets to anybody. So then everybody could have bought tickets. So in that case, it's not really violating anything. You made it possible. Do you see?
And I think, for me, I think that the question of speech is still like censored, and because in the Constitution, dangerous speech is not allowed, right? You cannot scream bomb in a private room. That's illegal, right? You will be convicted for inciting panic, right? And I think they find it's hate speech and it's dangerous speech to start, saying the things he says, right? So I think we have to modify his speech, and we have to really think about what speech really consists of, right? And at what moments you can regulate it because of the possible dangers that speech can bring. So I think this idea that free speech is just like something we all have, it's at least from my point, it's not something that should be allowed. Hate speech, dangerous speech should be regulated and not allowed. One, and two, also this idea I think of democratic dialogue is also dangerous, I think, because it lends legitimacy to the other side. It says that all arguments are equally legitimate.
But
And I don't think
shouldn't
that's
that
true.
be-
To say, let's argue, should women have rights? And then we have a dialogue on that question. It gives one side legitimacy when it shouldn't even have
But
legitimacy.
if you are being truly
Because we don't
liberal,
have the other side being
Well, see,
argued.
I could
This is
never
what
agree
the
with
debate
this.
is. Like,
Yeah.
what is it to be a good liberal?
yeah, if you're, and I kind of go to think that if you're truly liberal, then you should let every side speak,
No,
whether
see,
it's
like,
right or wrong, to us.
Internally, it boils my blood when, say, certain like sense and nonsense are put on the same platform as if they both deserve
Exactly.
the same platform to
And
talk.
that's
But
what
still, that
free
has.
speech does
but
that.
where I
It puts
come-
nonsense and sense on an equal footing.
But I agree with that version of free speech.
That
it
nonsense
should-
and sense
yes,
should dialogue.
It should be
Yeah, I
allowed,
agree with
and
Get ready
and-
for the election.
and it is that is why I think another part of my frustration with these events is the general, like, this might sound very condescending, but the lack of awareness and ignorance of the general public. That the whole point of free speech, and I personally feel a democracy is only possible with an educated electorate, right? Like, when you have these two people speaking, it is your duty to be able to synthesize whether this is,
Trump, like the exit poll shows, he gets supporters from the uneducated
I know,
people
yeah,
with
it's
college
0.6, I
degrees.
think 60% of his supporters do not have a high school diploma.
Yeah,
But he has beat the other
There's plenty of people
contenders
who have
on college.
PhDs who are
Yeah.
trying to like, I
Yeah.
mean, this comes down to a
Yes.
question. The kind of conceptual question here is like, what is like, what is the difference between like speech, hate speech, native speech, and like ideology? Right? The point is, you can have immensely educated or immensely uneducated people, but they will not always, and they could know everything they need to, and yet they will vote against their interests, right? Why do the working class vote conservative very often?
Yeah.
It's not because they don't know what it's like to be poor, right? It is a certain function of ideology, a certain way of not being able to know what one can say or do. So, like, I feel like the Trump thing, you could educate them, you could forcefully educate them, but then still be like white supremacists, right?
No, go for it.
And to bring the JNU story together with this, I mean, what I find interesting is how in the JNU case you have BJP and affiliated right-wing Hindu organizations suppressing the leftist activity. And here we have the Trump movement, but I mean, they both represent, I think, similar social movements in that in India you have a Hindu majority that feels threatened. Here you have a white majority that feels threatened.
Right.
And,
Very random.
and we see the politics of that playing out in both places in some interesting ways. And yeah, so when it's the oppressor claiming the role of victim is when it gets really like a funhouse mirror kind of situation.
But that's also, I was thinking about this earlier, like the white majority here, like that feeling of being threatened, I get. A lot of immigration, migrant population coming in, etc. The Hindu majority thing, I don't get. Like, I don't know why the Hindu majority in India are threatened. There's Muslims, Christians, they make a minority population, like so, it's not even 15% of the country's population really.
But
I
it's
mean, it's
also
just weird.
Dalits and other.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
others,
You have to,
so
so maybe we should categorize it as a Brahmanical
Yeah,
majority
Hindu,
or
like upper class
Brahmanical.
supremacy.
Yeah,
And that is pretty much what they are
that I get,
sort
yeah.
of representing, the Hindutva screaming.
I had an interesting argument with someone on Facebook the other day. He's a very liberal person, generally like not right wing at all. This man's very centrist, and he is a PhD from Texas A&M. He works in University College London as a professor. We're having this conversation, and I was talking about the UIC protests, and then it moved to Kanaya, and this video I posted of Kanaya's speech after he got released from jail, and this man was very offended that I would think that I'm being liberal by actually supporting Kanaya's speech, and his point was that JNU itself is very left-leaning, anti-Brahmanical, group. and they constantly stop Durga Puja from happening because it's considered Brahminical rites. They constantly stop a lot of these Hindu rituals that are very Brahminical on the campus, and so they're very violent with their protests when it comes to Brahminical rituals on campus. And so this person was asking me, how can you support a group who is, supportive of minorities like Dalits and Muslims, but who is still very anti, some other, group or caste or whatever, be it high or low? Then how do you actually evaluate this group as, liberal if these people are, protesting in their own ways and in very violent ways?
Did you mention a particular group on JNU?
The DSU. The DSU is known to present at all sorts of majority Hindu rights, disrupting them, making them cancel it, and creating.
Who are the DSU?
Kanaya, Kumar, and all these.
Oh.
Yeah, they're the Democratic Students Union. Australian leftist.
Kanaya Kumar is not part of DSU. He's part of the All India Students Federation.
Yeah,
but they're all they're like allies on campus. Pretty much all
They're
of them
left.
leftist Maoist.
Yeah. They're a leftist Maoist. Yeah, that's a good point. So this person was, and I did not really have an answer to that.
Right.
Because
that is a good question.
Yeah.
To ask, even though you're speaking up for minorities, then when does the table turn and you're sort of committing acts of destruction on the other side?
Yeah.
Are they just acts of protests then, or?
Yeah. So it becomes politicized. The entire Kanaya issue has become so politicized, really because the fact that they are taking a political stand, and the fact that Kanaya now is, even though he's now said that he does not want to campaign for the Communist Party of India, they're trying to sort of, make him their symbol for state elections in Kerala and West Bengal, and many other parts. So, once it's politicized, in mass terms, the person itself or the speakers themselves are politicized, then does it really matter if it's free speech, hate speech, dangerous speech?
I mean, not to play devil's advocate here, but in this particular case, personally, my problems were only with the facts of what happened and what went down. Like what happened later, all sorts of other crap, like bad footage and blatant misrepresentation of facts and all of that, and now this new, him becoming the poster boy for sort of communist politics, right? And we can definitely.
And they're trying to revive themselves. The Communist Party of India, those who don't know, have practically died in the last 10 years. They literally, there are a few octogenarian members who are still sitting in the parliament doing absolutely nothing. And then suddenly they seem to be awakened up, whoa, we've got a young face, let's grab him.
No, but isn't that just a natural outcome of what the BJP is doing? Yeah. Wasn't this bound to happen?
Yeah.
And it should happen, right? Maybe.
Yeah, but here's the deal though, about 75% of India has become very pro-Modi.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
So if this,
how most of the country is I know, Professor, I have the same face. I see a lot of, and mainly because there's a lot of young entrepreneurs, people who are working in the tech industry, they want progress, they want economic growth. So for them, Modi is that poster boy for development. And so a lot of people who have otherwise been very liberal, and I still believe they're liberal, suddenly they've become pro-Modi. And it's...
I see something similar happening here.
Exactly, these are the parallels.
Yeah, where people are sick and tired of political correctness.
Yeah.
And, and Trump, the businessman, right?
And we have to put up with, paying lip service to minorities and women and gays. And, let's just forget about that and get on with business or get on with white supremacy or both.
Whatever, will get us ahead or whatever makes us
whatever is in the interests, the crude, blatant interests of the dominant.
Right, and the way that Trump phrases it is that the reason this country is not great enough anymore is because it just sort of cowers down to these things, right? It doesn't speak up for itself, as if, And I've had this conversation with so many of his followers, where like, tell me one thing that's racist that Trump says. And I'm like, I could write you entire books, but they're looking only for those keywords, right? Like he never uses the N word, or he never uses this or that. So it's like, it's almost as if the only problem with being racist is political correctness. It almost sounds like that. Like, you know, if you're politically correct, then you're not really racist. It's not a problem there.
Or to put it differently, being against racism is political correctness.
Right.
Being against sexism is political correctness. Being against
Which is part of the liberal agenda, right? That
the
political
liberal
correct-
agenda
yeah.
is politically correct, right?
Yeah, which it seems to still harbor these same racisms or patriarchy, but under the guise of.
And you
best
have to-
practice.
It seems like what this issue of speech brings out too is the sort of contradictions of the nation state, right, as a structure. Because it seems from all of these examples, there's this claim of being anti-American, or right, these are anti-American.
Or
Trump usually
anti-Indian.
says, or anti-Indian, right? So this question of properly belonging to the nation, and then speaking out against certain injustices is what sort of takes you out of being a proper nation.
And the ideology of fear, right? How it's sort of used to manipulate people to believe that they're at risk, and that the only way that they can protect themselves is through the nation, right? Standing with people who have similar interests, similar goals. Sameness, yeah.
And whether or not you can protest instruments of government, right? Like, for example, like a major part of their protest was against the, as I mentioned, the atrocities that the Indian military is currently, doing in Kashmir, has done for decades in the northeastern Seven Sister states. And so basically, what they're doing is kind of under the Armed Forces Special Provisions Act. There's a special, so it's almost like a modified military rule that's going on in Kashmir. And Kashmir is a particularly tender issue in Indian politics, right? It's like an open wound in the face of our nation, right? And everybody only talks about Kashmir when it's like, who does it belong to? Is it ours or is it Pakistan's? They feel no problem in talking about Kashmir as if like it's a matter of ownership, right? But on the other hand, nobody wants to talk about the fact that the military is doing really like horrific things there. But we don't talk about against our armed forces, like that's like treason. So.
Yeah, and I thought we should also address the question of nationalism and the idea that how somehow free speech is directly linked to this idea of nationalism. You can speak freely as long as it is within the borders and within the patriotism that's assigned to you as a good Indian, American, whatever citizen. But
as long as it doesn't threaten the
it doesn't threaten the nation state, then
Whatever.
you're okay. And I think that's in the Indian case it's very relevant because most of the people who are I think about 75-80% of the country are probably anti-Kanhaiya Kumar and what he said, because they think, oh, it's anti-national. And I've been saying this for a while, so all of you know about this. But the education system perpetrates that. They teach you to be good citizens. From a very young age, they're taught patriotism. You're supposed to know all your freedom fighters for the independence movement, who were the colonial leaders, colonial period, the leaders in the colonial period who fought the British, who were not. You have to memorize national anthems, national pledges. It's like a mini RSS within schools, but this time for centrist, for creating that nation state or ideal citizens for that nation state. So I'm not surprised that everybody thinks that this person Kanhaiya has become anti-national. It's just that somehow the nation state becomes more important than constitutional rights, and there is such a.
But I mean, that's interesting because has anybody, like even liberal writers in India, have they talked about that at all?
A lot of the professors are having sort of open, free for all lessons in sort of like, you know, what
That
does
was
it mean?
wonderful, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to protest, and that's
The-
kind of where a lot of my ideas came from as student. Let's try to understand, like for example, they had a talk on the sedition law. What is its colonial root? That was the law that was used by the colonial powers to even stop our freedom movement.
To put Gandhi in prison.
Gandhi in prison. And now you're using those laws, that antiquated, crazy law, against people of a free nation, right? So they had a speech about that. They had speech about like a lesson on sort of subaltern studies and a lot of other.
Maybe I should give a background. The JNU, the university professors actually got these public lectures out.
Right.
So they would give talks to anyone who cared to listen.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, outside, like in the public space.
In the plaza,
And there was
sort
a
of,
lot
yeah.
of people who came and just sort of sat and
Yeah.
listened.
And I think that changed the dialogue even a little bit. Even being so far away, I at least heard new terms being, discussed on
Yeah.
public forums. That like people were like, okay, so these are things to think about. Like, what is subaltern? What is the subaltern? Like people.
Since we are just here and Sun Young can sort of join us as a guest, could we, because we're discussing this, could we think about something like that through the post-colonial studies group for the university? That, we could perhaps get some people, experts, to talk publicly, maybe out on the grass when the climate is better, about some of these things. Because,
Problems of the nation state.
not just that, like,
Which one?
It all comes back to nations.
We could just kind of like,
remember how Professor Lichty had this back and forth with Blake at a couple of semesters back
That's true. Almost exactly a year
about post-colonial studies, and Blake kept asking him questions, and it was very clear that Blake did not get it. He's he didn't. Yeah, don't say this to anyone. It was very clear that he did not understand sort of the foundations of post-colonial studies, colonial movements. It was very clear. It was coming from a very Americentric perspective. And I was wondering that it would be great to actually bring these people and sort of almost educate them in a way.
I mean,
I wonder if we would like to get educated from other people of things we don't know about as
But
well.
I think this goes back to something we were talking about earlier. In the university setting, yes, it is about being aware, but a lot of times it also isn't. Right? Like, it's not like people don't know about post-colonial studies.
They don't know the nitty-gritties of it, really. Like,
I don't think
they care, but that's
That's
the
not
thing.
the
It's how do you engage with these people and make them aware or care about these things, and so that we can have a more genuinely knowledgeable dialogue with them.
You have to beat it out of them,
Yeah.
Push them out the cave by force.
Even as I was voicing these concerns that I had, there have to be certain sort of a base vocabulary, a base understanding. I feel that sounds very condescending to a lot of my friends I know, and it can come across as that whole trying to educate might sound very sort of condescending to a lot of people. But I also think that it's not possible to talk about these topics in a nuanced way if some of us are absolutely unaware of these other fields of research or academic